911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, and prepared for the worst. This is an emergency. There's a criminal in our neighborhood. The woman's voice was shrill, breathless, as if she had just witnessed a robbery in progress. What's happening, ma'am? A delinquent is trespassing and causing destruction. He's got some kind of dangerous weapon. She gasped dramatically, attacking private property. The dispatcher's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Weapon? Attack? This sounded serious. Can you describe the suspect? He's on some kind of rolling device. Moving fast, doing aggressive maneuvers. The dispatcher frowned. Rolling device? Ma'am, are you saying he's on a skateboard? Yes, that's what I said. A dangerous skateboard. The dispatcher exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. This wasn't the first time she had taken a ridiculous call from an HOA neighborhood, but the woman on the phone was already screaming for urgent police backup. She had no choice but to send officers. Jake Harrison had no idea he was about to be the subject of a 911 emergency call. He was just enjoying the afternoon, gliding across the smooth pavement of his own driveway, perfecting a kick flip. The air was crisp, and for once, there was no homework looming over him. Then the screech came. You? Stop right there. Jake sighed. He didn't even have to turn his head to know who it was. Mrs. Thornton. Every HOA had one. That one neighbor who had nothing better to do than make everyone's life miserable. The self-appointed lawmaker, judge, jury, and executioner of all things neighborhood peace. And here she was, stomping down the sidewalk, her arms crossed, her nose upturned as if she had just smelled something offensive. Are you seriously skateboarding? Jake exhaled through his nose. Here we go. I'm in my own driveway. Mrs. Thornton, I am the president of this HOA, young man, and I know for a fact that skateboarding is illegal here. Jake raised an eyebrow. Illegal skateboarding? That's not a rule, he said flatly. Mrs. Thornton's lips tightened. It should be, she huffed. Do you have any idea how dangerous that thing is? You could be damaging property. What if you hit a car? What if you scratch the pavement? What if you crash into a pedestrian? Mrs. Thornton, I'm literally just doing a kick flip, Jake said, demonstrating it in the next second, smoothly flipping the board under his feet. Mrs. Thornton shrieked. You see, that was an aggressive maneuver. Jake blinked. What? Before he could even respond, Mrs. Thornton was already pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police, she declared. Jake stared at her. You're calling 911 because I'm skateboarding? Because you're being a nuisance, she snapped. And you're endangering the neighborhood. Jake groaned, running a hand down his face. He had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that arguing with Mrs. Thornton was like arguing with a brick wall. Except the brick wall had a really loud voice and called itself the queen of the HOA. So, he did the only logical thing. He skated away. Oh no, you don't. Come back here, you little criminal. Jake kept skating, casually rolling down the sidewalk, ignoring Mrs. Thornton's furious screams behind him. She was still talking to 911, waving her arms around like she was directing traffic. A few minutes later, he turned into his own home, where his dad, was watering the lawn, blissfully unaware of the impending disaster. Hey, Dad. Hey, sport. How was the session? Mrs. Thornton just called the cops on me. I paused. What? Jake shrugged. Yeah. She started screaming that skateboarding was illegal and that I was a danger to society. I closed my eyes. Not again. This wasn't the first time Mrs. Thornton had thrown a fit over something petty. Last month, she tried to fine the neighbors for having the wrong shade of blue on their trash bins. Before that, she lost her mind over a parked car being half an inch over the driveway line. And now, apparently, skateboarding was a felony. You sure she actually called the police? I asked. Oh yeah, Jake said. She was yelling into the phone like I was committing grand theft auto. I sighed, shutting off the hose. All right, let's go see how this circus plays out. We didn't have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 police cars rolled up, lights flashing. Mrs. Thornton stood triumphantly in the middle of the street, pointing at Jake like he was a wanted fugitive. There he is. Arrest him. The officers stepped out, hands on their belts, scanning the area. They looked at Mrs. Thornton, then at Jake standing there with his skateboard under his arm. One officer, a tall guy with a mustache, frowned. Wait, ma'am, are you saying the emergency is a kid skateboarding? Mrs. Thornton gasped as if personally insulted. Not just skateboarding. He's been terrorizing the neighborhood with that thing. It's dangerous. It's against HOA policy. The officer glanced at me. Sir, is that true? Nope, I said. She just doesn't like my son and makes up rules to control people. Mrs. Thornton scoffed. Oh, you're just going to take his word for it. The officer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, you do realize that calling 911 over a non-crime is considered abuse of emergency services, right? Mrs. Thornton's face twitched. This was an emergency, she shrieked. An emergency is someone breaking into a house, the officer said dryly, not a teenager doing skateboard tricks in his own driveway. Mrs. Thornton's jaw dropped. Are you saying you're not going to arrest him? The officers exchanged looks. The mustached one turned back to me and Jake. We're really sorry for the inconvenience, sir. You and your son have a great day. Mrs. Thornton's face turned beet red. No, you're supposed to uphold HOA rules. We uphold the law, ma'am, the officer said. Not imaginary neighborhood laws you made up. At that moment, I thought the situation couldn't get any funnier. I was wrong, because the officer's partner suddenly looked at Jake again, frowning. Wait a minute, Harrison? Your last name is Harrison? Jake nodded. The officer's eyebrows raised. Your uncle wouldn't happen to be Judge Harrison, would he? Jake smirked. Yeah. What? Mrs. Thornton's entire body went still. And just like that, the game had changed. The moment the officer mentioned Judge Harrison, I saw the exact second Mrs. Thornton realized she had made a catastrophic mistake. Her smug expression flickered, a quick dart of her eyes. A gulp so loud I almost heard it. But of course, she wasn't about to admit she had just called the cops on the nephew of a highly respected judge. Mrs. Thornton's brain did what it did best, scrambled for a way to spin the situation. Judge Harrison? Oh, what a coincidence, she chirped, her voice suddenly sugar-sweet. Such a fine, upstanding man. Of course, I wasn't implying that his nephew was a criminal, just a little misguided. Jake raised an eyebrow. Misguided? Yes. Mrs. Thornton clapped her hands together, forcing a laugh. You know kids, they can be so rowdy. And I was just, ma'am, the officer interrupted, not buying a single word. 5 minutes ago, you called 911 screaming that this young man was attacking private property with a dangerous rolling device. Mrs. Thornton flinched. Well, that might have been a slight exaggeration. The mustached officer, Officer Reynolds, exhaled through his nose, visibly annoyed. Let me get this straight, ma'am, he said, crossing his arms. You called an emergency line, wasting police resources, because you personally don't like skateboarding? Mrs. Thornton gasped in fake outrage. That is not what I did, she insisted. I called because he was violating HOA rules. This is a crime. Officer Reynolds pulled out his notepad and flipped a few pages. I checked the HOA bylaws before coming here, he said. There's no rule against skateboarding. Mrs. Thornton's entire body tensed. Well, there should be. It's a dangerous activity. It could cause damage. What if, ma'am? The officer cut in, his voice firm now. That's not how laws work. You don't just make them up when you feel like it. The second officer, a younger guy named Officer Davies, turned back to Jake. Son, did you do anything besides skateboard? Jake shrugged. Nope, just skating in my own driveway. Not bothering anyone. Just practicing. Did you damage anything? Hit a car? Endanger anyone? Nope. Davies turned to Officer Reynolds and nodded. Sounds like a false report to me. Mrs. Thornton's face drained of all color. False report? This is not a false report. Reynolds clicked his pen and started writing. Ma'am, I'm issuing you a formal warning for misuse of emergency services. If you do this again, you could be facing a fine or legal action. Mrs. Thornton sputtered. You're punishing me? What about him? She jabbed a finger at Jake. He still needs to be dealt with. His uncle being a judge doesn't mean he gets to do whatever he wants. Officer Reynolds sighed heavily. Ma'am, he was skateboarding on his own property. That is not a crime. Mrs. Thornton sniffed loudly, realizing she had no allies here. She turned toward me, her last desperate attempt to assert dominance. Well, what do you have to say about all this? She demanded. I smiled. I think this is hilarious. Mrs. Thornton's eye twitched. This is not funny, she snapped. Oh, it's hilarious, I corrected. You really thought you could call the cops on a teenager for doing kick flips, and now you're standing here getting written up while the whole neighborhood watches. Mrs. Thornton's jaw clenched as she suddenly realized we had an audience. Several neighbors had come outside, some pretending to water their lawns, others very openly recording on their phones. HOA Karen at it again, someone muttered. Is this for the Facebook group? Another neighbor whispered, nudging his wife. Oh, you know it's going up. Mrs. Thornton's hands balled into fists, and I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. This is a conspiracy," she shrieked. "You're all against me. I am the HOA president. I am the law here." Officer Reynolds stared at her, unimpressed. "No, ma'am," he said. "The law is the actual law, not whatever you decide it is." Then, as if to seal the deal, his radio crackled. "Unit 17, update on that call." Reynolds pressed the button. "False alarm. Just an overzealous HOA president calling in a personal grievance. We're wrapping up here." Mrs. Thornton let out a strangled noise like a dying tea kettle. But I wasn't done. "Hey, Jake," I said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Why don't you show the officers that trick you were working on?" Jake grinned, stepping onto his skateboard. With one smooth motion, he rolled back, gained momentum, and landed a perfect kick flip right in front of Mrs. Thornton and the cops. The neighbors cheered. Even Officer Davies smirked. "Not bad, kid." Mrs. Thornton looked like she was going to explode. She had lost, completely. But before the officers left, Officer Reynolds turned back to Mrs. Thornton, giving her one final warning glare. "You should be careful who you call 911 on, ma'am. Judges take false reports very seriously." Mrs. Thornton froze, because suddenly she realized the full consequences of what she had done. And I could tell by the sheer terror in her eyes. She was starting to regret it. Mrs. Thornton stood frozen, her hands gripping the hem of her sweater like it was a lifeline. Her brain was working overtime, trying to find a way out of the mess she had just created. But there was no way out. The police had warned her. The neighbors had witnessed everything. And worst of all, she had unknowingly dragged a judge's nephew into her ridiculous vendetta. The realization settled on her face like a crashing wave. I could practically hear her thoughts. "Oh no, what have I done?" Jake, meanwhile, was enjoying every second of it. "So," he said casually, flipping his skateboard up into his hands, "are we done here? Or do you want to call in the National Guard?" Mrs. Thornton's eye twitched so hard I thought she might collapse. Officer Reynolds, still holding the citation ticket, let out an exhausted sigh and addressed me. "Sir, I assume Judge Harrison will be hearing about this?" I smirked. "Oh, I'll make sure of it." Mrs. Thornton whipped her head toward me, her expression shifting from outrage to pure panic. "Wait, there's no need for that," she blurted out, voice suddenly trembling with forced politeness. Jake and I exchanged a glance. Mrs. Thornton backing down. That was new. "Oh no, I think Judge Harrison will love to hear about how his nephew was almost arrested because of an illegal kick flip," I said, barely containing my laughter. Mrs. Thornton clutched her chest like she had been personally attacked. "Now, let's not overreact," she stammered. "Surely we can all just forget this happened." Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, 5 minutes ago you were demanding we haul this kid away in handcuffs. Now you suddenly want to forget this happened." Mrs. Thornton let out a strained laugh. "Oh, well, you know, misunderstandings happen." Jake snorted. "A misunderstanding is forgetting someone's name. Calling the cops on a kid because you hate skateboards is just sad." I could tell Mrs. Thornton wanted to lash out, but she was pinned in a corner. If she kept pushing, she knew this would spiral into something much worse for her. Unfortunately for her, it already had. That night, I made the call. Judge Harrison, my brother, was not amused. "She called the police because of a skateboard?" he repeated, his voice flat and unamused. "Yep, and she lied about a crime happening." Silence. Then a slow, deep inhale on the other end of the phone. Well. It's always interesting when people try to weaponize the law without understanding how it works." I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Send me the officer's name and badge number. I'll be having a word with the department about this." I grinned. Already on it. Jake, sitting across from me at the dinner table, perked up. "Wait, does this mean Mrs. Thornton's in actual trouble?" "Oh, you have no idea." By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Mrs. Thornton's meltdown had gone viral, or at least neighborhood viral. The HOA Facebook page was flooded with clips of her screeching at the officers, demanding Jake be arrested, and then immediately panicking when she realized she had called the cops on a judge's nephew. The comment section was a goldmine. "This is the same woman who fined me for having my trash can out an hour too early. So skateboarding is a crime now? Guess my 8-year-old is going to federal prison. LOL. Mrs. Thornton, you've officially lost your mind. Please resign." And then my personal favorite. "Does anyone know where we can find an HOA-sized skateboard?" Asking for a friend. Mrs. Thornton, naturally, lost it in the comments. She tried arguing with everyone, claiming it was all taken out of context, that she was just looking out for the safety of the neighborhood, that she was being unfairly targeted. No one bought it. Even worse, the HOA board noticed. That afternoon, I got an email summoning me to an emergency HOA meeting. The subject line, urgent concerns regarding HOA president's conduct. I laughed so hard I almost choked on my coffee. The meeting was brutal. Mrs. Thornton sat at the head of the HOA conference table, arms crossed, glaring at everyone like a dictator clinging to power. The other board members looked exhausted. Mrs. Thornton, one of them sighed, rubbing his forehead. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? Mrs. Thornton huffed. I was doing my duty as HOA president. Another board member, a woman who had clearly had enough of Mrs. Thornton's nonsense, crossed her arms. By calling 911 on a kid and then lying about it? I didn't lie. Mrs. Thornton snapped. I just may have exaggerated slightly. Silence. Mrs. Thornton, the woman continued. We received a notice from Judge Harrison's office this morning. Mrs. Thornton stiffened. What kind of notice? The board member slid a piece of paper across the table. He's requested a formal review of your conduct as HOA president and has filed an official complaint about your misuse of emergency services. If this goes to court, you could face actual charges. Mrs. Thornton looked like she was about to pass out. Charges? She squeaked. The board member nodded. And given the overwhelming complaints from residents about your behavior, we're putting it to a vote. Mrs. Thornton's face turned ghost white. Vote? What vote? To remove you as HOA president? Mrs. Thornton. Her jaw dropped. You can't do that. The board members exchanged glances. Actually, one of them said, flipping through the bylaws, we can. And after this disaster, I think we should. I sat back in my chair, arms crossed, enjoying every second of it. Jake, sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered, this is the best thing I've ever witnessed. I grinned. Oh, just wait. It gets better. Because Mrs. Thornton was about to lose everything, and it was all her fault. Mrs. Thornton sat at the head of the HOA meeting table, her fingers digging into the armrests of her chair. Her face was pale, her eyes darting from board member to board member as they deliberated her fate. But she wasn't just panicking about losing her HOA throne. No, she was terrified of what came next. Because while she could whine, manipulate, and guilt-trip her way through an HOA meeting, she couldn't out-talk the law. And the law had just entered the room. The double doors swung open, and Judge Harrison stepped inside. The entire atmosphere shifted. The HOA board members sat up straighter. The neighbors in the audience fell silent. Even the ones who had been openly recording Mrs. Thornton's meltdown on their phones suddenly held them lower, as if afraid of disrespecting a man with real authority. But the real show? Mrs. Thornton. She went completely rigid, her fake confidence evaporating on the spot. Judge Harrison didn't even look at her at first. He just strode in with purpose, his expression unreadable as he took his seat across from the board. Then, finally, he leveled his gaze at Mrs. Thornton. Mrs. Thornton? Mrs. Thornton jumped at the sound of her name. Why? Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand why I'm here? Mrs. Thornton let out a strained laugh, waving a dismissive hand. Oh, Judge Harrison, there's no need for formalities. I'm sure this is all just a big misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? He interrupted. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it, the kind of authority that only a judge who spent decades in courtrooms could wield. Mrs. Thornton swallowed hard. Well, yes, she stammered. I never intended for things to escalate this far. I was just looking out for the neighborhood. Judge Harrison took out a folder and calmly placed it on the table. Then he opened it and began reading aloud. 911 call transcript. Timestamped 3:42 p.m., February 17th. Mrs. Thornton's face went white. There's a delinquent terrorizing the neighborhood, he read. He's damaging property. He has a dangerous weapon. He needs to be arrested. He looked up at Mrs. Thornton, expression unreadable. A dangerous weapon, Mrs. Thornton? Mrs. Thornton opened her mouth, then closed it again, her lips trembling. That's not how I meant it, she blurted out. I was exaggerating. Judge Harrison flipped to the next page. He's attacking private property. Another pregnant silence. Mrs. Thornton sank lower in her chair. He was on a skateboard, Mrs. Thornton. The judge continued, voice still neutral but firm. In his own driveway. It was dangerous. Mrs. Thornton tried, grasping at straws now. What if he had run into someone? What if he had broken something? Judge Harrison snapped the folder shut. So, you called 911 on a hypothetical? Mrs. Thornton sputtered. I was just. Mrs. Thornton. Judge Harrison leaned forward, finally dropping the formal tone. Do you realize that making a false police report is a crime? Mrs. Thornton stopped breathing. A crime. It wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It wasn't just an embarrassing Facebook fiasco. This was real, legal trouble, and the man across from her had the power to make it happen. Your Honor, please, she suddenly pleaded, voice cracking. I'm a respected member of this community. I was just trying to do my duty. I never meant to cause any harm. Judge Harrison held up a hand, stopping her mid-ramble. I have already spoken with the police department regarding this case. Mrs. Thornton's hands gripped the edges of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. As it stands, the judge continued, you will not be formally charged. Mrs. Thornton let out a strangled gasp of relief, clutching her chest. That if you meet the conditions I'm about to set. Mrs. Thornton froze. Conditions? Judge Harrison nodded. First, you will issue a public apology to my nephew, Jake Harrison, for the false allegations you made against him. Mrs. Thornton visibly flinched. Second, he continued, you will reimburse the city for the cost of dispatching police officers for a frivolous emergency call. Mrs. Thornton's face contorted like she had swallowed a lemon. And third, the judge tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked onto hers like a hawk about to strike. You will resign from the HOA board. Immediately, the room erupted into whispers. Mrs. Thornton's mouth fell open. Resign? Yes, Judge Harrison said simply. Your behavior has been documented. Your actions have been reckless. And your position has clearly gone to your head. It's in everyone's best interest that you step down. Mrs. Thornton looked around, expecting backup, but she found none. The board members, who had spent years quietly suffering under her rule, nodded in agreement. The neighbors in the audience were smirking, whispering, holding back laughter. Mrs. Thornton was alone. This isn't fair, she snapped, eyes wild. You can't just force me to resign. Judge Harrison calmly slid a piece of paper across the table. That is a petition signed by over 80% of the neighborhood calling for your removal, he said, tone casual. If you don't resign, we'll simply vote you out. Mrs. Thornton stared at the paper in horror. She had lost completely. With shaking hands, she grabbed a pen and, with an angry scowl, signed her name at the bottom. The room erupted into cheers. Jake leaned over to me, grinning. Dad, this is the best day of my life. I laughed, told you it'd get better. Because HOA Karen was finally dethroned, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. The ink on Mrs. Thornton's forced resignation wasn't even dry before the room erupted into cheers. Neighbors whispered excitedly, some openly grinning, others shaking hands like they had just won a revolution. Mrs. Thornton, she sat there seething, her face twisted in rage, watching her kingdom collapse around her. For years, she had ruled this HOA with an iron fist, handing out ridiculous fines, calling the police over minor infractions, and treating every resident like they were subjects in her personal empire. And now, she was nothing. Just another bitter, ex-HOA dictator. But Mrs. Thornton wasn't the type to go down quietly. No, she was going to burn everything on her way out. The immediate fallout. Mrs. Thornton stormed out of the meeting, knocking over a chair in the process. This is not over, she screeched, spinning around at the door. You'll all regret this. Nobody looked even remotely worried. In fact, one of the board members, Mr. Collins, an elderly man who had been a target of Mrs. Thornton's wrath for years, just sipped his coffee and said, You're still here? Mrs. Thornton's eye twitched so hard I thought she might explode. But she wasn't done. Oh no, she was about to make one last, desperate move. Mrs. Thornton tried to sue and failed miserably. Less than a week after her humiliating removal, Mrs. Thornton did what every entitled HOA tyrant does when they lose power. She threatened to sue everyone. She marched straight into a law office, slapped down a stack of handwritten complaints, and declared that she was filing a lawsuit against the entire neighborhood for emotional distress and defamation. The lawyer barely glanced at the papers before chuckling. Ma'am, he said, pushing the stack back toward her. This is not a case. Mrs. Thornton's face twisted. What do you mean it's not a case? She shrieked. You voluntarily resigned. There's video evidence of you making a false 911 call. And you've been documented violating HOA procedures for years. The lawyer leaned forward, lowering his voice. If anything, Mrs. Thornton, you should be grateful nobody is suing you. Mrs. Thornton froze. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in her entire existence, she had no comeback, no power, no control. With a strangled noise, she snatched up her papers and stomped out. And that was the moment it truly hit her. She was done. Mrs. Thornton became the laughingstock of the neighborhood. By this point, Mrs. Thornton's meltdown had gone viral, at least in local circles. The HOA Facebook page flooded with memes. Someone photoshopped her face onto a medieval queen being dragged off a throne. Another posted a fake neighborhood crime alert that read, "Wanted, former HOA president. Crimes, false 9/11 report, general menace to society, criminal hatred of skateboards." Even local businesses got in on the joke. The neighborhood coffee shop put up a sign that read, "Skateboarders welcome, unless you're Karen." People laughed whenever they saw her in public. She tried to go grocery shopping, and a cashier casually asked if she'd like to pay with her HOA fine collection fund. Mrs. Thornton hissed like a cat and stormed out. Jake, absolutely thriving in this new Mrs. Thornton-free era, rolled up on his skateboard one day. "Dad," he said, "you think if I build a half-pipe in the driveway, she'll actually explode?" I laughed. "Don't test it, son. She might call Homeland Security on you next." The final straw. Mrs. Thornton moved out. Mrs. Thornton lasted exactly 1 month before she finally cracked. The combination of public humiliation, no HOA power, and being legally cornered was too much. Her house went up for sale overnight. Rumors spread like wildfire. "I heard she's moving across town to another HOA. God help them. What if she just starts another dictatorship somewhere else?" Nah, her reputation is ruined. No HOA is going to let her near power again. And sure enough, within weeks, Mrs. Thornton was gone. Her house sold, and she disappeared into the abyss, never to terrorize our neighborhood again. The day the moving trucks pulled away, Jake celebrated the only way he knew how, with one final, glorious kick flip in the middle of the street. Neighbors clapped and cheered. Even Officer Reynolds drove by, rolled down his window, and gave Jake a nod of approval. "Nice form, kid." Jake beamed. "Thanks, officer." The neighborhood was finally free. A new era without Mrs. Thornton dawned. With her gone, the HOA actually started functioning like a normal association again. No more ridiculous fines for nonsense. No more secret rule changes. No more dictatorship. The new HOA president was a chill old guy who mostly spent his time gardening and waving at people. "The only rule I got," he said at the first HOA meeting, "just don't set anything on fire." Everyone laughed. Jake leaned over to me and grinned. Best HOA president ever. The final twist arrived months later. We randomly got an update on Mrs. Thornton. Apparently, she tried to take over another HOA in a different neighborhood. She failed miserably. The moment her new neighbors Googled her name, they found every post, every meme, every video of her downfall. She was instantly rejected from the HOA board. From what I heard, she was now just another resident, stuck under someone else's rules. No power, no control, just a bitter, powerless Mrs. Thornton. And honestly, I think that's the best punishment she could ever receive. Because now, whenever she sees a skateboard rolling down the street, she can't do a single thing about it. And that is justice.